Hi, my name's Wendy Adler, and I'm happy to present an art talk today about art appreciation, literally how to appreciate art. I've been a speaker on the subject for about 20 years for students of all ages. I began giving these talks when my sons were in elementary school. I've continued to lead tours and talks over the years. Now most of my students are senior citizens. I lead monthly discussions on a wide variety of topics, different artists, art periods, comparing and contrasting. But when I speak to a group for the first time, I almost always use the talk that you're about to hear today, toast points. While most people have had some form of art education in school, often the classes are about making things or creating art. Very rarely are they educated in how to actually look at art and form a narrative, start to engage. Opinions are easy to form. You can look at something and say, I like this or I don't. But can you often explain why you do or don't like it? I used to hear audible groans from my seniors about the contemporary pieces of art that I wanted to talk about. But by using toast points, I'm able to get them to consider individual elements and aspects of the work and to take the time where maybe they can learn to appreciate the work in ways that they wouldn't have before. I believe this approach will work with a variety of ages and all interest levels. So join me as we talk about toast. So today's talk is all about trying to get people to engage with art, how to look at art, particularly art that they walk by in a museum and maybe they don't understand, or art that they look at and they shake their head because they don't like it. Well, why don't they like it? In order for somebody to be able to create their own narrative or connection to art, they probably need to know what's the purpose of art in the first place. And in order to know that, they have to know what is the artist's job. What roles does an artist have? So that's why I have this as my first slide. What are the roles of an artist? Well, the artist's job is to show us the world in a new way. It's obviously their own take on the world. It's their approach, it's their creativity, and it's their inspiration. And hopefully their idea doesn't look like anybody else's. But that would be a big role of the artist. Show us something different, show us something unique. The artist also is going to show us a visual record of people, places, and events. These could be things that happened that the artist was witness to. These could be historical things, and it's the artist's take or vision on what they think may have occurred. It could be something that might happen in the future. But an artist can give us something visual to create those ideas and to help formulate those ideas. Beautifying objects is an important role that the artist has. Everybody has a favorite sweater or a coffee cup that they default to or something that they look at on the wall of their office. And hopefully those things are beautiful or special or different. It's something more than just a utilitarian styrofoam cup. Maybe it's a certain color. Maybe it has a texture that you like. Maybe it creates a mood for you. But by beautifying everyday objects, the artist elevates the meaning, makes them special for us. And lastly, the artist is going to give us something visual for things that aren't visual, ideas, concepts, things like love or truth. We can use symbols for those things, but it's more meaningful and impactful if an artist creates his vision, his or her vision, of what love might look like, what truth might look like, or representative of these ideas that don't have materiality. Now we can talk about analyzing art. I've created a mnemonic device, my toast points, to try to help people connect. A good way to remember some basic analytic tools when you look at art. I didn't actually create the toast points, but I do employ it in all my classes. When I started volunteering as an art teacher for middle schoolers, 5th and 6th graders, but I also find that this method works with my senior citizens who I give presentations to now. Toast points is a great way to remember some basic analytics when you're looking at a piece of art and you don't really know where to start. So what are toast points? Well, the first T in toast stands for type. What type of art are we looking at? Is it a still life? Is it a portrait? Is it a landscape? And we're going to go through each of these points individually as we go. What does the O stand for? O stands for open or closed. Is the work uh, complete within the borders, or does it extend beyond the borders of what we're actually seeing? The A stands for allegorical or realistic. Is the picture full of symbols that are supposed to represent other things, or is it a pretty realistic representation of something? The S stands for static or kinetic. What kind of energy does our picture have? Is it quiet or is it full of motion? Sometimes mood is also part of static or kinetic, and we'll talk about that as we get to that slide. And then lastly, we have tones. We have warm colors, we have cool colors, we have monochromaticism. What kind of colors have been used in this work? Now at the bottom of this slide, you see that I've also indicated historical context and art versus craft. Those are two additional points that I like to bring into the discussion, but that didn't fit quite as neatly into my mnemonic toast. So here we have our first T, the type or topic. What are we looking at? What kind of painting is this? On the left, of course, we have still life, a very common type of painting that you might see in a museum or hanging on the wall at somebody's house. A still life, as I explained to my students, is generally an arrangement of objects that probably aren't going to move while you're painting them. It could be a vase of flowers, it can be fruit. And back in the day, such as in this Dutch still life, an artist would use a still life to show off their skill. So in this particular example, we have a beautiful reflection in that coffee urn. That would have been a very technical skill that the artist was trying to show us. On the right, we have a portrait. Everybody knows what a portrait is. It's a picture that has people in it. There's really no more that needs to be explained, other than the fact that a portrait can be abstract. The figures do not have to be realistic. We have landscape. Again, a landscape can also be abstract. In this case, we have a beautiful abstract landscape by Georgia O'Keeffe. And even though it's abstract, we know it's a landscape. We can see that it's a portrayal of nature. And then genre. Over on the right, we have Diego Velázquez's portrayal of old woman frying eggs. Genre, I explained to my students, is just an everyday activity. It's something that we've all seen, that we can all identify with, something that happens routinely. The next point is O, and that's for open or closed. Is our picture open or closed? Does it extend beyond the borders? So when we look at our Salvador Dali picture here, The Persistence of Memory, there's not only is it surreal and mysterious, but there's probably additional elements outside of the picture that would help us complete the narrative, or at least come up with a narrative. As it stands, just like it is, the picture itself seems to be missing some elements. Therefore, we would call that open. On the right, with the two Fridas, that picture looks pretty complete within itself. Whether you do or don't like the narrative, you can tell that what the artist is trying to do here is focus on the two Fridas and tell a story that's going on. We don't need any elements that extend beyond the borders to give us a complete story. Next, we have allegorical or realistic, our A from our toast points. Allegorical, something symbolic. Are there a lot of symbols or symbolism being represented in the picture? So we have here Goya's The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, one of the etchings from that series. Allegory is a hidden meaning, and it can be moral or religious or political. In this particular example, we have a human figure who looks like he's sleeping, and we have owls and bats and cats and kind of a scary composition going on here. The animals are all representing different things. In this particular case, the owl is representing folly, the bats are representing ignorance, and the cats represent luck. And of course, over time, the meaning of those symbols or the meaning of the allegory could change, because that's not what those animals represent to us now. But at the time, this would have been a very allegorical work. To the right, we have a realistic portrait of George Washington. Everybody that sees this picture, whether they ever met George Washington or not, would definitely say this is much more realistic than allegorical or pretend. Next, we have static or kinetic. Static is a stillness. There's minimal energy or movement in the picture. We're looking here at Monet's Haystacks, one of the pictures from his series, and it's showing a moment in time. We have sunlight, we have the reflection of the sunlight on the haystack, but the general peace and quiet of the subject matter gives us a nice stillness to that picture. On the right, of course, we have Starry Night, which has a lot of energy and movement, particularly in the sky. We have a sense of movement from those brush strokes and from the swirls up in the sky, from the rays that seem to be emanating from the stars and from the moon. And even though I think the mood of Starry Night could also be considered peaceful or quiet, we're looking at a sleeping village after all, the mood is a little different than the energy level. So I like to point that out. I like to have the mood discussion along with the discussion about energy level in a picture. So the haystacks, I think, would be a static picture, and Starry Night would be kinetic, full of movement and energy. In this next picture, I'm showing why we have the movement and the energy. In our haystacks picture, we have some very strong triangles. Those haystacks are triangular in shape, and the triangles anchor our eye into the subject of that picture. Whereas with Starry Night, not only do we have triangles, like our big cypress tree in the front left, but we have a lot of diagonal movement thanks to the brushstrokes and the motion in the sky, shown by those red lights or lines. The red lines show the direction that our eye is moving when we look at Starry Night. And so I like to bring in the discussion about how the energy of a picture is generally created by the diagonal movement and the triangles in any work. Lastly, our toast points, we talk about tone. We're looking at two Rothko color field paintings here. We have very, very warm colors used on the left, lots of red and fuchsia and yellow and orange. And on the right, we have those cooler blues and greens and indigos being used. Pretty self-explanatory. I like to bring a discussion about the color wheel and primary colors and secondary colors into play here, but you can definitely start just with the tones. Now, we're talking about historical context. Again, it doesn't fit neatly into my toast points, but I like to emphasize how important historical context can be. The actual definition is a painting that depicts a historical or mythological or religious event. It can be referred to as social or political art. For example, here in Guernica, Picasso's masterpiece, we're showing his interpretation of what happened when Guernica, the city, was attacked with these surprise air bombings from above. Even if your students don't know the history of what happened with Guernica, they can look at this picture and they can start to give you adjectives. They can talk about the anguish and the upsetting expressions on the people's faces. They can note that they see these animals that look somewhat confused. They can understand the tone of the picture with the blacks and the whites and the grays being not particularly bright and happy and colorful. And they can start to put together their own idea of maybe what this work meant. And then, of course, if you give them the historical context, the work will take on a lot more meaning. Now, artists often will portray something that happened in the past, which they obviously wouldn't have been witness to, or something in the future that they haven't had a chance to witness yet. And again, historical context is important because then we're getting the sense of what the artist felt those events would or might look like at the time of occurrence. And next, I like to bring in a discussion about art versus craft. This one's near and dear to me because I happen to be a docent at the Houston Contemporary Craft Center. And when we bring school groups or seniors through, we like to talk about, why is this called the Contemporary Craft Center? What is the difference between art and craft? We know that craft is often referred to as part of arts and crafts, and that it would fall under the umbrella of art. But here I have a definition of what is art. Art, quipped by a French philosopher, is art for art's sake. Art is just made for beauty, for aesthetic pleasure. We have this sculpture here on the left by Barbara Hepworth, and its only purpose is really for us to be able to enjoy it in the setting that it's presented. On the right, we have a beautiful Van Gogh picture of irises. And while there certainly is a lot of narrative that we could attach to this, the picture itself is painted to hang on a wall and for people to enjoy the beauty and the pleasure of being able to see and connect with the picture. But craft is completely different. Craft generally can be defined one of two ways. Generally, craft has arisen from a human need. So we needed vessels, we needed utensils, we needed warmth, we needed shelter. So we needed those things. And so craftsmen would create something from the need. And then the other way to define craft is craft generally has been made from one of 6 materials. Here I've given you another mnemonic. I happen to really like mnemonic devices. This one is the sentence, "Tom will pet my cat gently." Why? Because each of the first letters of "Tom will pet my cat gently" represents one of the categories of materials that most craft would fall under. So we have textiles, we have wood, paper, metal, clay, and glass. And an easy way to remember those material groups is by using the sentence, "Tom will pet my cat gently." So now that we've gone over the general idea of toast points, let's put it into play. This is the JV version of toast points. This will be the easy one for you. We're going to apply our toast points to this Bierstadt landscape painted in the 1860s. I've already told you what the first T would stand for here. It's clearly a landscape. Nobody's really going to argue with you about that. If you want to challenge your students, you could ask them, what time of day are we looking at here in this landscape? Obviously, we're outside. Where's our source of light? But you could start to play with the questions in your analysis. Is this open or closed? I suppose it depends on your point of view. I would say that it's probably open. I've heard people tell me that it's open because nature is boundless and that it's always open. I've heard people say that they think this is an open picture because the sky is so vast. But I've also had people tell me closed, and here's why. The compositional elements that Bierstadt employed here, with his very large craggy rock on the left and the grove of trees and little mountain outcrop here on the right, kind of frames our picture. And it creates a complete scene with those two boundaries. He manages to focus our attention on the rock formation in the center, or maybe on the people in the front center of this picture. So you could go either way on this. You could decide it was open, or you could argue that it was closed. A lot of times with my students, I'll employ devil's advocate. And if they come to a general agreement on one, I'll go ahead and swap it out and try to get them to see it the other way. So that's also kind of a fun exercise. Next, is this allegorical or realistic? I think we would all agree that this is realistic. It's not necessarily exactly what you would see if you walked outside. And so some people might want to call this representational instead of realistic. But I think we could all agree that this isn't really allegorical. Is it static or kinetic? Well, I guess again, it depends on your point of view. The mood of the picture is very quiet and peaceful, but nature is never really still. So you could argue that it is static just by virtue of the fact that we have very little motion on the water. Even though the clouds are definitely there, they don't appear to be moving. The trees don't look like they're being moved around by the wind at all. So you could say that this is a static picture. But again, you could argue that it was kinetic because nature is never still, maybe because the grayness in the sky would um, lead us to believe that the sky is moving, the clouds are moving. We can see a little bit of ripple effect on the water from the boat that is there. So you could go either way with that. And then lastly, tone. What tones are we looking at here in our picture? We have a very warm golden tone, and that obviously comes from the natural light that Bierstadt was trying to employ here. But you know, there isn't a whole lot of color from the color wheel specifically on this picture. Sometimes what I'll have my students do is close their eyes, count to 3, and open their eyes and tell me what color would strike them first. And I think in this particular picture, the warmth of the golds, the softness of that green, maybe it's the gray, I don't know, but it would definitely lead to an interesting discussion. Lastly, historical context. Bierstadt, of course, was a pioneer in painting the American West. He had gone out west and made many, many sketches, gone back to his East Coast studio and started painting these idealized versions of the American West. They were very, very popular overseas in England. They were dying to know, why were people going to America? What were they seeing there? And this was really their only means of being able to see what Yosemite or the American West was going to look like. So from a historical context, we could say that Bierstadt was painting an idealized version, a very romanticized version of the American West at this time. And that would help give understanding as to why most of his works are so pretty. All right, so now that we conquered the toast points in our first piece, let's move on to the varsity level here. Jackson Pollock. We're looking at silver over black, white, yellow, and red, the titled work here that was done in 1948 by Jackson Pollock. Now, if you don't know anything about Jackson Pollock, you might be rolling your eyes. Now, most of you are art teachers, so you're probably not rolling your eyes, but I can assure you a lot of my students would be rolling their eyes right now. Some of them would be muttering under their breath that they never liked this kind of work, that their grandchild could do this, et cetera, et cetera. And so I love the challenge of having them employ their toast points and attempt to analyze and look at this painting with a little bit more of a thoughtful approach. So here we go. What type of work is this? I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that we could call this an abstract work. You might, if you look at it long enough, be able to start seeing things or recognizing elements, but I think on first impression, we could all agree that the type here would be abstract. Is it open or closed? Well, again, I think the longer you look at this particular picture, you might decide that you have enough there to come up with a narrative. But I think generally we would call this an open work. That would be because obviously these lines extend off the page in so many different directions. When Pollock was making this work, he would have had a very large canvas on the floor of his barn studio, and he would have flung the paint all over the canvas, but then at the end of his painting, he would have stood back and he would have edited out the section of this very large canvas that he wanted to present as his final production. So this is really a cropped version of a much larger composition. So we might consider it closed, at least from Pollock's perspective. But that's a pretty stilted argument. I think overall we would agree this is open. Is this allegorical or realistic? Well, again, it's kind of tricky to apply those terms to this particular one, unless I give you a little more context. We know that Jackson Pollock was mentally troubled. He was depressed, he was alcoholic, he had suicidal thoughts, he had a lot of self-doubt, and so all of those things maybe come into play. And if you wanted to look at this piece as perhaps a representation or a pictorial representation of Jackson Pollock's mindset, I suppose you might want to call it realistic, certainly in an abstract way. Again, that's a little bit of a stretch, but there's really no allegory here either. So hard to put a label on it this time. Static or kinetic? Well, if you think it's static, then I don't know what to tell you. This is perhaps the most kinetic of any work I can think of offhand. All of the diagonals, all of those lines extending off the page in all different directions, lots and lots of squiggle and energy, even in the layers, even if you're able to kind of block out the top layer of the silver and focus more on the black or on the yellow or the red. I think that everybody could agree that the energy in this picture is voluminous. There's so much to it. There's so much movement, many, many diagonals. And then lastly, the tones of this picture. Well, we know what colors he wanted us to think of. He's titled the picture Silver over Black, White, Yellow, and Red. Silver, black, and white, of course, are not on our color wheel, so they don't really count in our tone assessment. And red and yellow in this particular case are not very warm. So again, you could have a very interesting discussion with your students about whether they feel that this picture is warm or cool. I would lean more towards cool just by virtue of how much white and silver there is. But the longer I have this picture up when I'm giving my presentations, I do get a lot of my students pointing out that those big black blobs in the picture allow them to have something to focus on. And because of that, they start to form their own toast point analysis, and sometimes it differs with what we had already covered. So this is a really fun exercise to employ with a work like this. Lastly, we look at historical context. As we know, Jackson Pollock was doing his work during the time of the abstract expressionists. And this particular kind of work, the action painting, fell into this band of New York rebel artists that were trying all kinds of different things, action painting and color field painting and minimalism and all these different paths that these artists were taking. So they were pushing limits. And after World War II, when a lot of artists had come to America from Europe to escape World War II, we had a lot of European influence, but New York, of course, had become its own art center. And so this kind of work would have been acceptable and would have been something that artists might have tried that was very different from what people had seen before. So I hope that these toast points will become useful to you in your approach with your students on how to look at art. I like to use these particularly on field trips or, as I said before, with art that they may not be understanding, and give them these mnemonic devices to go ahead and start wrapping their head around how can I look at art, how can I appreciate art that might be different or that maybe I didn't like or that maybe I like but I don't know how to explain why. So that's the whole point of today's talk. Lastly, I appreciate the feedback. I would love to hear from you. I can be reached at the Gmail address here, wendyarticulatingart@gmail.com. And if you're interested in any of my other talks, I have been making recordings during the time of the pandemic, mostly so that my cooped up seniors in their senior communities that were on lockdown would have something to watch. You're welcome to go to my YouTube channel. There's no fee for subscribing, and look at any of those videos and use those in your lectures if you think they might be helpful. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope to hear from you and be a part of this conference again in the future.